The village of Ban Nong lay nestled between sprawling jungles and towering mountains, a serene picture of isolation. To the casual observer, it seemed like an idyllic haven, where the old Hmong traditions thrived in harmony with nature. But the locals knew the forest held secrets, dark enough to send chills down the spine of even the bravest souls. Siang, a restless and curious 17-year-old, found the whispered warnings of his elders more intriguing than frightening. The elders would sit in a circle under the banyan tree recounting tales of the tiger ghost. It was said that this spirit, half tiger and half human, roamed the jungle, preying on those who disrespected the forest's sanctity. The stories painted vivid images of glowing eyes, the stench of death, and claws that tore through flesh as if it were paper. One humid evening, as the setting sun bathed the village in shades of gold, Siang approached his grandmother. She was the most respected storyteller in the village and held the repository of countless myths. He leaned closer as she prepared herbal tea over the fire. "Grandmother, tell me the truth," he implored. "What is the tiger ghost? Is it real?" Her hands paused mid-stir. The firelight flickered across her lined face, casting deep shadows. "It is not a question of real or not, child," she murmured. "The forest remembers those who dishonor it. The tiger ghost is the memory of vengeance." Siang frowned. Her cryptic reply only fueled his curiosity. "But no one has seen it, right? They're just stories to keep kids from wandering off." His grandmother's gaze turned steely. "No one sees the tiger ghost and lives to tell the tale." The conversation ended there, but the seed of intrigue had taken root. That night, as the village grew silent under a blanket of stars, Siang made a plan. He would venture into the jungle with his two closest friends, Kang and Mai, to seek the truth about the tiger ghost. After all, wasn't it time for the old superstitions to be debunked? The following morning, Siang, Kang, and Mai packed supplies and set off toward the jungle's edge. The villagers watched them go with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. As the trio entered the forest, the air grew cooler, heavy with the earthy scent of moss and decay. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, and the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves seemed muted, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. Kang, ever the joker, picked up a stick and held it like a spear. "So, Siang, where's your ghost tiger?" "I'll fight it off if it shows up." Mai rolled her eyes. "Let's just focus on not getting lost, okay?" Hours passed as they trekked deeper into the jungle. The trees grew larger, their gnarled roots snaking across the ground like sleeping serpents. They stumbled upon strange claw marks etched deep into the bark of a tree. The marks were impossibly large, too high to have been made by any ordinary animal. "Whoa," Mai whispered, her voice trembling. What kind of creature could do this? Siang's heart raced. He reached out to touch the marks, only to jerk his hand back as if burned. The claw marks exuded a faint heat, as if they had been freshly made. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, they found a clearing with what appeared to be an animal carcass. The smell hit them first, a sickly sweet odor of rotting flesh. The carcass was shredded, its innards strewn across the forest floor. King gagged. This isn't normal. "Let's head back," Mai urged, fear etched across her face. But Siang shook his head. "Not yet. We came here for answers." They pressed on until twilight, their nerves fraying with each step. Just as they decided to turn back, a guttural growl echoed through the trees. It was low and menacing, vibrating through their very bones. "What was that?" Mai hissed, clutching Siang's arm. "Stay calm," he whispered, though his own voice shook. The growl came again, closer this time. They froze, their eyes scanning the shadows for movement. Then, just beyond the tree line, they saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes watching them, unblinking. The three of them bolted, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor. The growl followed, morphing into a blood-curdling roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. When they finally burst out of the jungle and into the safety of the village they were Elena had always wanted to live in a peaceful suburb, far from the noise and chaos of the city. When she found a quaint little house at the end of Pinewood Drive, she felt like fate had intervened. The rent was affordable, the street was quiet, and her nearest neighbor was a friendly older man named Mr. Harper. From the very first day, Mr. Harper seemed overly welcoming. He brought her homemade pies, offered to help with her groceries, and even fixed a broken light on her porch. At first, Elena thought she had lucked out with the perfect neighbor, but it didn't take long for things to feel off. One evening, as she unpacked her belongings, she noticed a shadow moving outside her living room window. Thinking it was a stray animal, she dismissed it. But then, she saw it again, lingering longer this time, just out of sight. The next morning, Elena found muddy footprints leading up to her window. She felt a chill run down her spine. Trying to brush it off as a prank, she decided not to let it bother her. Days passed, and Mr. Harper's visits became more frequent. He would appear at odd hours, sometimes just standing on her porch without knocking. "Everything okay, Elena?" he asked one night, startling her as she watered her plants. "Yes, Mr. Harper," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just settling in." But his eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, and she felt an inexplicable wave of unease. That night, she woke up to the sound of soft tapping on her bedroom window. Determined to shake off her growing paranoia, Elena decided to focus on personalizing her home. One room in particular intrigued her, a small locked study at the back of the house. The landlord had mentioned it was used for storage and hadn't provided a key. Curiosity got the better of her. With the help of a locksmith, she finally opened the door. What she found inside was unsettling. The room was filled with photographs, dozens of them, all of different people, none of whom she recognized. The pictures were pinned to the walls, some with notes scribbled on the back: "Met on Monday," "Asked too many questions," and "Watched her leave." In the center of the room was a single chair and an old camera mounted on a tripod. Her stomach churned as she realized some of the faces looked familiar. One, in particular, caught her eye. It was a picture of her, taken as she unloaded her boxes on move-in day. Elena's hands shook as she stuffed the photos into a bag, intending to take them to the police. But as she left the room, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Mind your own business, Elena." Panic set in. How did they know her name? And more importantly, how did they know what she had just done? Elena decided to confide in her neighbor. After all, Mr. Harper had been nothing but kind. She approached him the next morning, the photos clutched tightly in her hand. "Mr. Harper, can I talk to you about something?" she asked, her voice trembling. He smiled warmly. "Of course, dear. Come in." As she entered his home, she was struck by how pristine and organized it was. But something felt staged. It was too perfect, almost like a showroom rather than a lived-in space. She showed him the photos, expecting shock or concern. Instead, his expression remained neutral. "Well," he said slowly, "you shouldn't have gone snooping where you don't belong." Elena froze. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Harper's demeanor shifted. His friendly smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You're not the first tenant here, Elena," he said, his tone menacing. "And if you're not careful, you won't be the last." Fear gripped her as she realized she had walked straight into the lion's den. Elena backed away from Mr. Harper, her mind racing. His words echoed in her ears, chilling her to the core. "You're not the first tenant here, and if you're not careful, you won't be the last." Desperate to leave, she stumbled over a corner table, knocking over a framed photograph. It clattered to the floor, revealing another picture beneath it, a woman smiling and carefree. Her face was familiar. Elena had seen it among the photos in the locked room. Mr. Harper bent down slowly, picking up the frame. His expression darkened. "She didn't listen either," he said almost wistfully. Elena bolted for the door, her heart pounding. She didn't stop running until she was back inside her house, locking every door and window. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. Every creak and shadow felt like a threat. She tried calling the police, but her phone displayed a no-service message. Then came the noise, soft shuffling outside her bedroom window. Gathering her courage, she peeked through the curtain. In the dim glow of the streetlight, she saw Mr. Harper standing on her lawn, holding something in his hand. It glinted in the light. A key. Her landlord's words came flooding back. "This house has one key. Don't lose it." But now she knew there was more than one. Elena spent the next day searching for clues. She started with the photo she had taken from the locked room. On closer inspection, she noticed something odd. In almost every picture, Mr. Harper was in the background, lurking. One photo had an address scrawled on the back. Hoping it would lead to answers, Elena drove to the location. It was an abandoned house, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown. Inside, the air was heavy with decay. In the basement, she found a collection of personal items, bracelets, watches, keys, each tagged with a name. She recognized some of the names from the notes in the locked room. Then she saw it, a folder labeled Elena. Inside were recent photos of her, along with detailed notes about her daily routine. One entry read, "She's growing suspicious. Move up the timeline." Her stomach turned. She wasn't just being watched, she was being hunted. As she turned to leave, she heard footsteps upstairs. Elena's breath caught as she listened to the heavy, deliberate steps. She crouched in the corner, her phone trembling in her hand. She dialed 911, whispering her location into the receiver. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. It was Mr. Harper. "Elena," he called, his voice calm and taunting. "You really should have minded your own business." He reached the bottom of the stairs, a knife glinting in his hand. "You don't have to do this," Elena pleaded, backing away. He smiled, a cold, empty smile. "Oh, but I do. You're just like the others, always poking around where you don't belong." Just as he lunged, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The police stormed in, shouting commands. Mr. Harper hesitated, giving Elena just enough time to grab a heavy pipe and swing it with all her strength. The knife clattered to the ground as he collapsed. In the weeks that followed, the police uncovered the full extent of Mr. Harper's crimes. He had been stalking tenants for years, carefully selecting and eliminating his victims. Elena moved out of Pinewood Drive, but the trauma lingered. She started a support group for survivors of stalking, determined to turn her nightmare into something meaningful. As for Mr. Harper, he was sentenced to life in prison. But even behind bars, his chilling smile haunted her dreams. Ryan was thrilled to move into his first apartment. After years of dorm life, having his own place felt like a dream come true. The building was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors and large windows that let in plenty of light. The landlord had warned him about the tenant in apartment 3B. "She's eccentric," Mr. Graham had said, avoiding eye contact. "Just keep to yourself, and you'll be fine." Ryan hadn't thought much of it. Eccentric neighbors were part of city living, right? The first week went by without incident. He heard faint noises from 3B occasionally, footsteps, the sound of something heavy being dragged. But it wasn't until his second week that things took a turn. Late one night, as he worked on a paper, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. Ryan froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It came again, louder this time. "Help me!" He bolted to his door, yanking it open, but the hallway was empty. The scream seemed to come from 3B. "Are you okay?" he called, knocking on the door. The scream stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a soft, scratchy voice replied, "Everything's fine. Go back to bed." Ryan hesitated. The voice didn't sound fine. It sounded strained, almost wrong. But what could he do? He wasn't about to barge into someone else's apartment. Uneasy, he returned to his unit, locking the door behind him. Over the next few days, Ryan started to notice odd things about the tenant in 3B. She rarely left her apartment, and when she did, it was only at night. He would hear her footsteps in the hallway around 2 a.m., followed by the soft click of the building's front door. One night, curiosity got the better of him. He peeked through his peephole as she passed. She was a thin woman, her hair tangled and unkempt. She carried a large duffel bag, holding it close to her chest. Ryan swore he saw something moving inside the bag. The next morning, he noticed a strange smell in the hallway, a mix of bleach and something metallic, like blood. When he mentioned it to Mr. Graham, the landlord brushed it off. "Old pipes," he said dismissively. "They stink sometimes." But Ryan wasn't convinced. Determined to figure out what was going on, Ryan decided to set up a small camera in the hallway. He positioned it discreetly in a potted plant outside his door, aimed toward 3B. That night, as usual, he heard the tenant leave around 2 a.m. The next morning, he eagerly reviewed the footage. What he saw made his blood run cold. The woman stepped out of her apartment carrying her duffel bag. But as she turned, Ryan caught a glimpse of her face. It was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and unblinking. She whispered something under her breath, though the camera couldn't pick up the sound. Then she looked directly at the camera as if she knew it was there. Ryan's heart pounded. How could she have known? The footage ended abruptly as the screen went black. The camera had been disabled. A soft knock on his door startled him. "Stop watching me," the scratchy voice said from the other side. Ryan knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He called the police, explaining what he had seen and heard. They agreed to perform a wellness check on 3B. When the officers arrived, the tenant refused to open the door. After hours of negotiation, they finally forced their way inside. What they found made the local news. The apartment was filled with jars of remains, human remains. The duffel bag contained bloody tools, and the walls were lined with photographs of the other tenants, taken through their windows without their knowledge. The tenant, whose name was revealed to be Margaret Vale, had been a wanted fugitive for years, linked to multiple disappearances. Ryan moved out the next day, unable to sleep in the building any longer. The memories of those screams, the smell in the hallway, and Margaret's chilling voice haunted him. But it wasn't over. Weeks later, Ryan received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of him taken through his apartment window. Margaret was locked away, but Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching him. He installed security cameras around his new apartment and kept his blinds closed at all times. But every now and then he would find small signs. An open window he knew he had locked. A single footprint outside his door. The fear never left him. Emily felt a sense of relief as she and her family pulled into the gravel driveway of their new home. After years of city life, the sprawling countryside with its towering oaks and whispering pines seemed like a dream come true. The house was modest but charming, with a wraparound porch and large windows that overlooked the woods. The realtor had promised peace and privacy, two things Emily and her husband, Mark, desperately needed after the chaos of the past year. "Mom, look!" 8-year-old Lily called, pointing toward the tree line. Emily followed her daughter's gaze. A man stood at the edge of the woods, his figure barely visible in the fading daylight. He was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, and seemed to be staring directly at them. "Probably a neighbor," Mark said, unloading a box from the car. But Emily felt uneasy. The man didn't wave or approach. He just stood there, unmoving. By the time they carried the last box inside, the man was gone. That night, as they settled in, Emily heard faint rustling outside their bedroom window. Peeking through the curtain, she saw nothing but the swaying branches of the trees. She told herself it was just the wind, but a gnawing sense of dread lingered. The following days were uneventful. Emily busied herself unpacking while Lily explored the yard. Mark commuted to work in the nearby town, leaving early and returning late. One afternoon, while hanging curtains in Lily's room, Emily noticed something strange. In the dirt below the window, there were footprints, large, booted prints. "Lily, did you see anyone outside today?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Lily shook her head. "No, but I saw the man again. He was standing by the trees watching me." Emily's heart sank. "What man, sweetheart?" "The one with the hat. He waved at me this time." Emily tried not to panic. She decided to walk to the edge of the woods herself, hoping to find some logical explanation. But as she approached, an overwhelming feeling of being watched washed over her. She called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The woods were silent, save for the rustle of leaves in the wind. That night, Emily and Mark installed motion sensor lights around the house. They told themselves it was for security, but deep down, Emily felt it was a warning to whatever or whoever was out there. The lights did little to ease Emily's fears. If anything, they only confirmed her worst suspicions. One night, as they were finishing dinner, the light outside the kitchen flickered on. Emily rushed to the window but saw nothing. "Probably a deer," Mark said, trying to reassure her. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Always the same light, always no visible cause. One evening, Mark had to work late, leaving Emily and Lily alone. As she tucked Lily into bed, her daughter whispered, "Mommy, he's out there again." Emily froze. "Who, sweetie?" "The man in the hat," Lily said, pointing to the window. "He's waiting for you." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, determined to put an end to the growing fear. As she shone the beam into the woods, she caught a glimpse of movement, just a shadow darting between the trees. "Stay away from my family," she shouted, her voice trembling. The forest answered with silence. When she turned to go back inside, she found something on the porch, a small bundle wrapped in leaves. Inside was a broken toy, one of Lily's which had been missing for days. The realization hit her like a punch. Whoever was watching them had been inside their yard. Emily could hardly sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside sent her heart racing. She kept the flashlight and a kitchen knife by her side, ready for anything. Around 2 a.m., the motion sensor light flickered on again. She tiptoed to the window, careful not to make a sound. The man was there. This time he wasn't lurking at the edge of the woods. He was standing in their yard, just a few feet from the porch. His wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, but Emily could see the faint glint of his eyes in the light. Her first instinct was to call the police, but she couldn't risk moving too quickly and alerting him. Instead, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911 as quietly as she could. "There's a man in my yard," she whispered. "He's just standing there, staring at the house." The operator assured her that officers were on their way, but Emily couldn't wait. She had to protect Lily. She ran to her daughter's room, locking the door behind her. Lily was sitting up in bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Mommy, he's mad," Lily said, her voice trembling. "How do you know that?" Emily asked, trying to stay calm. "He told me," Lily replied, pointing to the window. Emily turned to see the man outside, his face pressed against the glass. His lips were moving, though no sound came out. The lights outside the house flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the yard and surrounding woods but found no trace of him. The officers assured Emily that they'd patrol the area, but she could tell they didn't take her seriously. Mark insisted they stay at a hotel for a few nights, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't solve anything. She needed answers. The next day, she ventured into the woods herself. She followed a faint trail, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. The deeper she went, the more she noticed strange things, symbols carved into trees, bundles of sticks tied together, and even a few small animal bones scattered on the ground. Then she found it. A clearing with an old, decrepit cabin in the center. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. Against her better judgment, Emily stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay. The walls were covered in photos, pictures of her family. There were shots of Lily playing in the yard, Mark unloading groceries, and even Emily herself, taken through the kitchen window. In the center of the room was a table with a single object, Lily's stuffed rabbit, its fur matted with something dark and sticky. A noise behind her made Emily spin around. The man was there, blocking the doorway. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Emily's instincts kicked in. She swung the flashlight at the man, catching him off guard and bolting past him out of the cabin. She ran as fast as she could, her feet slipping on the uneven ground. She could hear him chasing her, his heavy boots crunching leaves and snapping twigs. When she reached the house, she slammed the door and locked it. "Mark, call the police," she shouted. Mark grabbed a baseball bat and stood by the door, but the man never tried to break in. Instead, he stood outside, staring at the house once again. The police arrived quickly this time, and when they searched the woods, they found the cabin. Inside, they discovered more disturbing evidence, personal items from other families, all of whom had gone missing in the area over the years. The man was arrested, but he refused to speak, his silence as eerie as his presence. Emily and her family moved out the following week, unable to bear the memories of what had happened. Years later, she still dreams of the man in the hat. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she swears she hears footsteps outside her window and sees a shadow just beyond the edge of the woods. The police had assured her that the man had been caught, but deep down, Emily wasn't sure. Some neighbors are better left unseen.